wealthy CEO never told his secretary how he felt until he saw her in another man's arms. Monroe straightened her blazer one final time and walked toward the corner office where Elias Crowder sat behind his desk, reviewing contracts she'd already perfected. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, his gray suit tailored to emphasize shoulders that had never carried the weight she lifted daily. He looked up when her heels clicked against the marble, and for just a moment, something flickered in his steel blue eyes. Recognition? Appreciation? It vanished so quickly she might have imagined it. Have you ever seen someone you cared about truly happy without you? Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. For 5 years, Monroe Baines ran a billion-dollar empire from behind a mahogany desk, until the morning she decided to walk away from the only man who'd ever made her feel invisible. The 45th floor of the Crowder Industries tower gleamed like a temple to ambition, floor-to-ceiling windows framing Chicago's skyline, while Monroe moved through the space like she owned every marble tile and crystal chandelier. But ownership was a funny thing. You could control every detail, manage every crisis, and know every secret, yet still be treated like expensive furniture. Monroe straightened her blazer one final time and walked toward the corner office where Elias Crowder sat behind his desk, reviewing contracts she'd already perfected. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, his gray suit tailored to emphasize shoulders that had never carried the weight she lifted daily. He looked up when her heels clicked against the marble, and for just a moment, something flickered in his steel blue eyes. Recognition? Appreciation? It vanished so quickly she might have imagined it. "The Morrison deal is ready for your signature," she said, placing the leather portfolio on his desk. Her fingers lingered on the edge, close enough to his hand that she felt the warmth of his skin, close enough to remember all the late nights when their hands had brushed over documents, when she caught him looking at her like she was more than just efficient. "Excellent work, as always." His voice held that familiar professional distance, but his eyes traveled from her face to where her silk blouse met the curve of her throat. "What would I do without you?" "You're about to find out," she thought, but smiled instead. "I'm sure you'd manage." He signed a contract with quick, decisive strokes, the same way he did everything, confident and controlled. When he handed it back, their fingers touched for longer than necessary. Electric current shot up her arm, the same jolt she'd felt for years but never acknowledged. The same connection he pretended didn't exist. Monroe. Her name on his lips sounded different today, softer somehow. "Is everything all right? You seem professional." The word came out sharper than intended. She pulled her hand away and stepped back, creating the distance he'd always maintained between them. "I have something for you." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out the cream-colored envelope she'd written and rewritten a dozen times. Her resignation letter. 5 years of devotion reduced to 2 paragraphs and a signature. Elias took it without breaking eye contact, his brow furrowing as he read. She watched his face change, surprise melting into something that looked almost like panic. His grip on the paper tightened until his knuckles went white. "You're leaving." Not question. A statement that sounded like he'd been punched in the gut. "I am." "What?" A single word cracked like a whip. "The salary? I can double it. Triple it. Name your price." Money. Of course that's where his mind went. Because everything in Elias Crowder's world had a price tag, including the woman who'd spent 5 years making his life run like clockwork. "It's not about money." Monroe picked up her purse, fingers steady despite the hammering of her heart. "Some things can't be bought, Mr. Crowder." His jaw clenched at the formal address. For 5 years, she called him Elias during their private moments, late nights working on deals, early mornings preparing for board meetings, quiet conversations over coffee when the rest of Chicago slept below them. Now the distance in her voice made him lean forward like he wanted to close the gap between them. "Monroe, if this is about, it's about respect." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with years of unspoken frustration. "I'll train my replacement. 2 weeks should be sufficient." She turned toward the door, her heels clicking against marble that had witnessed 1,000 moments like this. Moments when she'd swallowed her pride and stayed because leaving felt impossible. Not today. Today, she was done being invisible. You can't just walk away. His voice followed her across the office, rough with an emotion he'd never let her see before. This company needs you. I need. The words died when she turned back to look at him. Really look at him. The man who could command a boardroom full of sharks, who made million-dollar decisions before breakfast, looked lost behind his massive desk. You need someone to organize your life, she said quietly. You'll find her. You always find what you're looking for when you're willing to pay for it. The elevator doors were already opening when she heard him call her name one last time. But Monroe Baines had spent 5 years answering when Elias Crowder called. Today, she kept walking. As the elevator descended from the 45th floor, carrying her away from the only job she'd ever loved and the only man who'd ever made her feel everything and nothing at once, Monroe didn't look back. But through the glass walls of his corner office, Elias watched her leave with something he'd never felt before, a panic. And in that moment, watching the elevator numbers count down like a timer on everything he'd taken for granted, Elias Crowder realized he was about to lose the most important person in his world. The woman who'd never been just his secretary. She'd been his anchor, his conscience, his heart, and he let her walk away, thinking she was replaceable. Have you ever felt indispensable to someone who treated you as replaceable? Have you worked for someone who saw your value but never acknowledged your worth? Drop a comment if you've been Monroe. Elias Crowder built an empire by never needing anyone, until his secretary walked out and took his ability to function with her. The 45th floor felt like a morgue without Monroe's presence. Elias stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at Chicago's skyline without seeing it. 3 days. 3 days since she'd walked out, and his perfectly ordered world had collapsed into chaos. His new temporary assistant, Rebecca something, had lasted exactly 4 hours before fleeing in tears. The second one made it through lunch before accidentally scheduling him for 3 meetings at the same time. The third hadn't even shown up. It wasn't their fault. They weren't Monroe. His penthouse office felt hollow without the soft click of her heels on marble, the gentle rustle of papers being organized with mathematical precision, the subtle scent of her perfume that somehow made the sterile corporate air breathable. Even the coffee tasted wrong. How had he never noticed that Monroe made his coffee differently? That she knew exactly how he liked his morning briefings organized? That she anticipated his needs before he voiced them? The answer hit him like a physical blow. He had noticed. He'd always noticed everything about Monroe Baines. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when concentrating. How she bit her lower lip when reviewing contracts. The small scar on her left hand from a childhood accident she'd mentioned once during a late-night strategy session. The way her eyes lit up when she talked about her weekend volunteer work at the Literacy Center. He'd memorized every detail about the woman who'd sat outside his office for 5 years, and he pretended it was professional interest. Efficient management. But standing in his empty office, surrounded by the chaos she'd prevented daily, Elias faced the truth he'd buried under control and corporate distance. He was obsessed with Monroe Baines. Had been since the day she'd walked into his office wearing a navy suit that cost more than most people made in a month and told him his previous assistant's filing system was criminally inefficient. She'd been 25 then, fresh from Northwestern with an MBA and attitude that should have intimidated him. Instead, it had intrigued him. Most people either feared him or wanted something from him. Monroe had looked him straight in the eye and told him his company ran like an expensive car with faulty brakes. Impressive on the surface, but dangerous in motion. She'd been right. Within 6 months, she'd restructured his entire operation. Within a year, his profits had doubled. Within 2 years, he couldn't imagine functioning without her steady presence anchoring his chaotic world. By year 3, he'd started finding excuses to keep her late. Strategy sessions that ran past midnight. Weekend emergency meetings that somehow stretched into dinner. Business trips where he booked adjoining hotel rooms and told himself it was for convenience. The memories hit him now like physical blows. Monroe leaning over his desk to review contracts, close enough that he could count the gold flecks in her brown eyes. Her hand covering his when he'd received news of his father's death, offering comfort without words. The night she'd fallen asleep on his office couch during a hostile takeover bid, and he'd covered her with his jacket, watching her sleep for longer than he'd ever admit. She'd been beautiful from day one, but somewhere along the way, she'd become essential. Not just to his business, to him. The way she laughed at his dry humor. How she stood up to him when no one else would. The quiet strength in her voice when she talked to him through difficult decisions. And what had he done with all that beauty, intelligence, and loyalty? He'd kept her at arm's length, paid her well, but never acknowledged that she was worth more than money. Let her think she was just an employee when she'd become the center of his entire world. His phone buzzed. A text from his business manager about the charity gala tomorrow night. The Children's Hospital fundraiser Monroe had organized every year since joining the company. He'd written the check automatically, the way he always did, never thinking about whether he'd attend. This year would be different. This year, Monroe wouldn't be there to handle the details, to make sure he said the right things to the right people, to stand beside him in the receiving line wearing a dress that made him forget how to breathe. Except she would be there, wouldn't she? The invitation was still in her name. Elias picked up his phone and dialed his driver. If Monroe was going to the gala, so was he. It was time to stop hiding behind corporate distance and professional walls. It was time to chase the woman he should never have let walk away. The invitation arrived by messenger at 3 p.m. Elegant script announcing the Children's Hospital Charity Gala. At the bottom, in handwriting he'd memorized, were 3 words that stopped his heart. Monroe Baines plus guest. When was the last time someone's absence made you realize what their presence really meant? Tell me about a person whose value you only understood after they were gone. He went to the charity gala to prove he didn't need her, and found her in another man's arms, laughing like she'd never been happier. The Palmer House ballroom sparkled with crystal and champagne, Chicago's elite dressed in designer gowns and $1,000 suits. But Elias saw only one thing. Monroe in midnight blue silk that hugged every curve, her smile radiant in a way that made his chest tight with recognition. She was beautiful when she was happy. And she was happy. Genuinely, brilliantly happy in a way he'd never seen during their 5 years together. Her laugh carried across the crowded ballroom like music, drawing his attention from whatever boring conversation he'd been pretending to follow with the hospital board members. She stood near the silent auction tables, her hand resting on the arm of a man Elias didn't recognize. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that came naturally rather than through corporate warfare. The stranger whispered something in Monroe's ear that made her throw back her head and laugh, the sound hitting Elias like a physical blow. When had he last made her laugh like that? When had she ever looked at him with that open, unguarded joy? Never. Because he'd spent 5 years keeping professional distance between them, treating her like expensive furniture instead of the extraordinary woman she was. The midnight blue silk moved against her skin like water as she walked, the dress cut just low enough to hint at curves he tried not to notice during countless late-night strategy sessions. Her hair was swept up in an elegant style that showed off the graceful line of her neck, the same neck he'd stared at across conference tables while pretending to review contracts. She looked like she belonged here, among Chicago's wealthy elite, despite having grown up in Bronzeville with a single mother who worked 2 jobs. Monroe had never talked much about her background, but Elias had made it his business to know. Just like he'd made it his business to know that she volunteered at literacy centers, that she sent money home to help with her younger brother's college tuition, that she turned down 3 marriage proposals in the past 5 years because she claimed she was too focused on her career. Looking at her now, glowing with happiness beside another man, Elias realized how blind he'd been. Monroe hadn't been focused on her career. She'd been focused on him, devoted to making his life run smoothly, his business successful, his world ordered and predictable. While he'd taken her for granted, the stranger's hand moved to the small of Monroe's back as they approached the bar, a possessive gesture that made Elias's jaw clench. The man ordered champagne, expensive champagne, Elias noted with bitter satisfaction. At least Monroe was with someone who could afford her. But money wasn't what made Monroe's eyes light up. It was the way the stranger listened when she talked, leaning down to catch every word like her opinions mattered. The way he guided her through the crowd without controlling her, his touch protective rather than possessive. Everything Elias had never been. Magnificent turnout, someone said beside him. Elias turned to find Dr. Harrison, the hospital's chief administrator, following his gaze across the ballroom. Ms. Baines outdid herself this year. Though I was surprised to hear she wouldn't be organizing next year's event. She won't be. The words came out rougher than intended. Her resignation from Crowder Industries, of course. Though perhaps she'll have more time for charitable work now that she's. Dr. Harrison paused delicately, exploring other opportunities. Other opportunities, like the man currently spinning her onto the dance floor, holding her close enough that her dress swirled around his legs like silk water. Elias watched Monroe dance with liquid grace, her body moving in perfect rhythm with her partner's. She'd never danced with him. 5 years of company parties, charity events, and business dinners, and he'd never once asked her to dance. He'd told himself it would be inappropriate, crossing professional boundaries. The truth was, he'd been afraid. Afraid that holding Monroe in his arms would shatter the careful control he'd built around his feelings for her. Afraid that once he touched her, really touched her, he'd never be able to pretend she was just his assistant. Now someone else held her, someone else made her smile, someone else got to breathe in her perfume and feel the silk of her dress against his hands. The jealousy that crashed over Elias was so intense it left him breathless. This was what wanting felt like. This was what need felt like. This crushing, desperate hunger for something, someone, he'd convinced himself he couldn't have. The song ended, but Monroe's partner didn't release her immediately. Instead, he said something that made her blush, her cheeks turning pink in a way that meant whatever he'd whispered was intimate, personal, possibly inappropriate. Elias found himself moving across the ballroom before conscious thought could stop him. He had to get closer, had to hear what was making Monroe laugh like she discovered joy for the first time. He positioned himself near enough to catch fragments of their conversation, using a potted palm as cover like some kind of corporate spy. "Can't believe you convinced me to come," Monroe was saying, her voice warm with affection. "You needed this," her companion replied, his tone gentle but firm. "You've been hiding behind that job for 5 years. And no time to remember there's a whole world outside that office tower." M.O. The nickname hit Elias like a slap. Intimate, casual, the kind of name you earn through closeness rather than corporate hierarchy. "Still think this is a bad idea," Monroe murmured, but she was smiling as she said it. "Trust me." The stranger lifted her chin with one finger, a gesture so tender it made Elias's chest tight with longing. "When have I ever steered you wrong?" When her companion whispered something in her ear that made her blush, Elias made a decision that went against every rule he'd lived by. He would follow them, and what he discovered would change everything he thought he knew about Monroe Baines. Have you ever seen someone you cared about truly happy without you? How did it feel to realize they were better off? Share that moment in the comments. The most powerful man in Chicago became a shadow in the night, following the woman who walked away, and discovered she'd been hiding secrets of her own. Elias Crowder had never followed anyone in his life. He was the one people chased. Investors seeking meetings, rivals trying to steal secrets, women hoping to catch his attention. But here he was, sitting in his Mercedes 2 cars behind Monroe's taxi, feeling like a stalker and not caring enough to stop. The taxi wound through Chicago's South Side, past neighborhoods Elias rarely visited despite owning properties there. Investment opportunities, his financial advisors called them. Gentrification projects that would boost his portfolio. He'd never thought about the people who lived there, who called these streets home. But Monroe had. Of course she had. The taxi stopped outside the Green Mill Jazz Club, a legendary venue Elias knew by reputation but had never visited. Too authentic for his usual crowd. Too real for the sanitized entertainment his business associates preferred. He watched Monroe emerge from the taxi, her midnight blue dress catching streetlight like captured stars. Her companion, The man who'd made her laugh at the gala helped her out with casual familiarity, his hand protective on her elbow as they approached the club entrance. Elias parked half a block away and followed, grateful for the crowd outside the venue. The Green Mill Jazz Club pulsed with music and warmth, a world away from sterile boardrooms and power suits. Here, Monroe moved like she belonged, her laughter genuine as brass instruments wailed stories of heartbreak and redemption. He found a shadowy table near the back, close enough to observe but far enough away to avoid detection. The club was packed with people who looked nothing like his usual circle. Artists and writers, musicians and teachers, people who valued soul over stock options. Monroe and her companion found seats near the stage, close enough that the music washed over them like liquid gold. Elias watched her close her eyes and sway to the rhythm, her whole body responding to sounds that made his corporate world seem sterile and lifeless. This was Monroe's real world. Not the 45th floor office where she'd spent 5 years managing his life, but this warm, authentic space where music mattered more than money. He studied her companion more carefully now. Mid-30s, well-dressed, but not flashy, with the kind of natural confidence that didn't need validation. The man watched Monroe with obvious affection, but something about his expression nagged at Elias. It was protective rather than possessive, fond rather than romantic. "You sure about this plan?" the man asked during a quiet moment between songs, his voice carrying just far enough for Elias to catch the words. Monroe twisted her champagne glass between her fingers, a nervous habit Elias recognized from countless board meetings. "He needs to understand what he lost, David. 5 years of my life, and he never saw me as anything more than efficient." David. The name triggered a memory, Monroe mentioning a cousin who'd helped raise her after her father died. Family, not a romantic rival. Relief crashed over Elias, so intense it left him dizzy. Then David's next words made his blood freeze. "You sure you want to go through with this? He doesn't deserve you after what he did." What he did? What had Elias done? The guilt in David's voice suggested something serious, something that went beyond professional neglect. Monroe's jaw tightened. "He made decisions about my life without asking me. Treated me like property instead of a person. I won't be anyone's charity case, David. Not even his." Charity case? Elias's mind raced, trying to understand what Monroe meant. He'd paid her well, promoted her regularly, trusted her with responsibilities that would make most executives jealous. How was that treating her like charity? "The shares were meant as a gift," David said quietly. Shares. The word hit Elias like a physical blow, and suddenly he understood Monroe's anger. She found out about the stock transfers. Somehow, she discovered his secret. For months, Elias had been quietly transferring portions of his company's shares into Monroe's name. Not as salary or bonus, but as ownership. He'd planned to tell her eventually, when he found the courage to explain that he wanted her as a true partner, not just an employee. But Monroe had discovered the transfers before he could explain, and she'd interpreted his gift as manipulation. "I was going to tell her," Elias muttered to his empty table, but the words felt hollow even to him. When? After another year of letting her think she was just his secretary? After she'd spent another 5 years organizing his life, while he pretended his feelings for her were professional? Monroe leaned closer to David, her voice dropping to a whisper Elias strained to hear. "Tomorrow I'll know if he really cares about me, or if I was just convenient. And if he doesn't show up, if he doesn't fight for you." Monroe's smile was sad but determined. "Then I'll know I made the right choice walking away." The music swelled around them, but Elias barely heard it. His mind was spinning with the realization that Monroe's resignation wasn't just about professional frustration. It was a test. A challenge thrown down by a woman who'd grown tired of being invisible. She wanted him to fight for her, to prove that she mattered beyond her ability to manage his schedule and organize his life. To show that 5 years of devotion meant something more than a good working relationship. From his table in the shadows, Elias strained to hear their conversation. When Monroe's companion said, "You sure you want to go through with this? He doesn't deserve you after what he did." Elias felt the ground shift beneath him. What had he done? And what was Monroe planning? When was the last time someone's simple touch left you breathless? Share your story in the comments. She discovered his secret the same way he'd hidden it, by accident, in a moment when neither of them was prepared for the truth. 3 weeks earlier, Monroe had been working late again. The 45th floor was empty except for security, Chicago's skyline glittering beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows like scattered diamonds on black velvet. She'd stayed to finish the Morrison acquisition documents, the same papers she'd presented to Elias that morning during her resignation. It should have been simple. Review the contracts, check the financial statements, ensure all signatures were properly witnessed. Routine work she could do in her sleep after 5 years of managing Elias's business empire. But when she'd opened the file cabinet to retrieve the supporting documents, her world had shifted on its axis. The financial documents spread across her desk like evidence of a crime. Months of share transfers, legal papers, her name appearing beside Elias's in ownership records she'd never seen, never been consulted about, never been asked to accept. Monroe Baines, listed as owning 37% of Crowder Industries. Her hands had shaken as she traced her signature on documents she'd never signed, transfers that had been happening for 8 months without her knowledge. The dates told a story she couldn't comprehend. Shares moved in her name after every major deal they'd closed together, every late night they'd spent restructuring acquisitions, every success they'd built as a team. Except they hadn't been a team. She'd been an employee, and he'd been making her a co-owner without her consent or knowledge. The worst part was understanding why he'd done it. The legal documentation was meticulous, clearly prepared by his personal attorney rather than the corporate legal team. This wasn't a business decision, it was personal, intimate, a gift from a man who couldn't express his feelings any other way. Elias Crowder, who controlled every detail of his empire, had been quietly giving her pieces of it for months, making her the second most powerful person in his company while she arranged his meetings and organized his files. She'd called his name without thinking, her voice echoing across the empty office. When he'd emerged from his private bathroom, hair damp from a shower he kept in his executive suite, Monroe had held up the documents with trembling hands. "What is this?" He'd gone perfectly still, those steel blue eyes reading her expression like a contract he needed to negotiate. For a moment, she'd seen something raw and vulnerable flash across his face. Hope, maybe, or fear. "It's what you've earned," he'd said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "What you've always been worth to this company. To this company. Not to him." Even when caught red-handed in an act of unprecedented generosity, Elias couldn't admit the truth behind his actions. "You made me a co-owner without telling me." The words had come out flat, emotionless, while inside she'd been screaming with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. "You've been transferring shares into my name for 8 months. The paperwork is all legal. My attorney, I don't care about the legality." The documents had scattered when she'd slammed them onto his desk. Months of secret planning spread between them like accusations. "You made decisions about my life without asking me. About my future, my career, my ownership of this company. You treated me like I was too stupid or too weak to handle the truth." Something had shifted in his expression then, the mask of corporate control slipping to reveal confusion and hurt. "Monroe, I was trying to take care of you, to give you security, power, a stake in what we've built together. Together." He'd finally said the word she'd longed to hear for 5 years, but had come wrapped in manipulation and secrecy. "We didn't build anything together," she'd whispered, the truth cutting through her like broken glass. "You built an empire and decided to share it with me, like I was a pet you wanted to reward for good behavior. Did it ever occur to you to ask what I wanted? To treat me like a partner instead of property?" The silence had stretched between them, heavy with 5 years of unspoken feelings and missed opportunities. Elias had reached for her then, his hand hovering over hers where it rested on the desk. "I never meant for you to feel like property. You're the most important." She'd pulled away before he could touch her, before his skin against hers could weaken her resolve. Important what? Employee? Asset? Investment? Person, he'd finished quietly. The most important person in my life. The words had hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. Everything she'd wanted to hear for 5 years, spoken too late and in the wrong context. Then why couldn't you tell me? Why did I have to find out by accident that you've been making me a business partner behind my back? Elias had looked away then, his jaw tight with whatever emotions he kept locked away. Because I'm not good at this, at feelings, at knowing how to show someone they matter without controlling the situation. And there it was, the truth that explained everything about their 5-year dance around each other. Elias Crowder, master of corporate warfare, didn't know how to love without controlling. Didn't know how to give without making it feel like charity. I resign, she'd said, the words coming out steadier than she'd felt. Tomorrow will be my last day. She'd expected him to argue, to make counteroffers, to negotiate like he did everything else. Instead, he nodded slowly, something dying in his eyes. If that's what you want. What she'd wanted was for him to fight for her. To admit that the shares weren't about business, but about love. To stop hiding behind corporate distance and acknowledge the connection that had been growing between them for 5 years. Instead, he'd let her walk away, just like he'd let her discover his feelings through legal documents instead of honest conversation. Back in the present, at the jazz club, Monroe's companion leaned closer. So when do we tell him the truth about us? Elias's blood ran cold. The truth about what? Who was this man, and what were they planning together? Has someone ever made a huge decision about your life for your own good without asking you? How did it feel to have your choices taken away, even with good intentions? Share your experience. The man holding Monroe's hand wasn't her lover. He was her family, her partner in the most elaborate plan of revenge Chicago's business world had ever seen. David lifted Monroe's chin with brotherly tenderness, his familiar gesture from childhood when she needed courage. You've given him 5 years of your life, and no time to see if he'll fight for even 5 minutes of his. From his table in the shadows, Elias couldn't hear the words, but he recognized the gesture. Protective, familiar, not romantic, something deeper, something that made his chest tight with a different kind of recognition. I can't keep pretending this doesn't hurt, Monroe whispered, her voice barely audible over the jazz quartet. Seeing him tonight, watching him watch me, David, what if we're wrong? What if he really doesn't care? David's laugh was soft but fierce. Girl, that man has been staring at you for 20 minutes like you hung the moon. He followed you here. When's the last time Elias Crowder followed anyone anywhere? The jazz club pulsed around them with music and warmth, a world away from sterile boardrooms and power suits. Here, Monroe moved like she belonged, her shoulders relaxed in ways they never were on the 45th floor. Her midnight blue dress caught the amber lights, and for a moment, Elias forgot why he was hiding in the shadows. He'd built an empire on reading people, on understanding motivations and weaknesses. But watching Monroe laugh with this stranger, this protector, Elias felt something crack inside his chest. She was beautiful when she was happy. When had he last made her laugh like that? So, when do we tell him the truth about us? David asked, leaning closer with conspiratorial whispers. Elias's blood ran cold. The truth about what? His hands gripped his whiskey glass until his knuckles went white. Monroe's internal conflict played across her face like a movie he'd watched for 5 years, but never understood. She remembered Elias's rare touches, the way his voice would soften when they worked late, the electric moment when he'd stand behind her chair to review contracts, close enough that she could smell his cologne, feel his breath on her neck. He transferred company shares into my name, David, for months, made me the second most powerful person in the company without telling me. Her voice carried hurt that cut through the music. How do you love someone in secret like that? How do you make someone a partner and never ask if they want to be one? David's protective instincts flared. Because he's a coward. Rich, powerful, brilliant, and scared to death of letting anyone see him actually need something. Monroe sighed, tracing the rim of her wine glass. Or someone. The music shifted to something slower, more intimate. Couples moved onto the small dance floor, and David stood, offering his hand with a grin that reminded Elias of Monroe's own smile. Family. They had the same eyes, the same stubborn chin. Come on, cuz. If we're gonna make him jealous, let's do it right. As they prepared to leave the jazz club, Monroe spotted a familiar figure in the shadows. The expensive suit, the way he held himself like he owned every room he entered. Even here, even hiding. David, she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. He's here. Elias followed us. David's smile turned predatory. Good. Game's working. But neither of them knew that Elias had just received a phone call that would destroy everything. His phone had been buzzing for 10 minutes, ignored while he watched Monroe dance. Now, as he finally answered, his assistant's panicked voice cut through the jazz music like a blade. Mr. Crowder, you need to get back here immediately. Blackstone Corp is moving tonight. Hostile takeover. They're filing papers as we speak. The phone slipped from Elias's hand. Have you ever had to stage your own worth to get someone to notice it? Sometimes we need our family to remind us we deserve better. Tag someone who's been your David. While Elias chased ghosts in jazz clubs, his enemies moved like sharks in corporate waters, and Monroe was the only one who could save him. The Crowder Industries building stood dark except for the 45th floor, where emergency lights cast harsh shadows across the mahogany and marble that had witnessed 5 years of unspoken longing. Elias burst through the lobby at 2:17 a.m., his keycard flashing red at every scanner. Denied, denied, denied. His own building was rejecting him like a body-fighting infection. Sir, the night security guard looked confused and terrified. Your access was revoked an hour ago. Board orders. 23 floors up, in the emergency boardroom, vultures in expensive suits were carving up his empire. Blackstone Corporation had been planning this for months, waiting for the perfect moment to strike when Elias was distracted, vulnerable, off his game. They never expected his secretary to own 42% of his company. Elias's phone rang. His lawyer's voice was grim. They filed at midnight. Stock manipulation charges, claiming you've been artificially inflating share prices. The board called an emergency vote to remove you as CEO. On whose authority? They have a majority. 51%. Unless what? Unless Monroe Baines exercises her voting rights. Elias, what the hell did you do? She owns almost half your company. In the emergency boardroom, 12 men in suits were discovering the same thing. Monroe's shares, transferred quietly over 18 months, legally documented, absolutely unbreakable, made her the second most powerful person in the room they were trying to control. Where is she? Demanded Harrison Blackstone, a man who'd been trying to destroy Elias for 10 years. We need her signature to complete the takeover. She resigned, said board member Peterson, shuffling papers nervously. Left 3 weeks ago. No forwarding address. Blackstone's smile was cold. Then we proceed without her. Absent shareholders forfeit voting rights after 72 hours. What they didn't know was that Monroe's phone had been buzzing for an hour. Text after text from numbers she didn't recognize, all saying the same thing. Emergency at Crowder Industries. They need you. But the text that made her heart stop came at 2 a.m. from an unknown number. They're moving tonight. If you ever loved him, get to the office now. The shares you don't know you own are the only thing standing between Elias and complete destruction. Monroe stared at the message in David's car, her hands shaking. How do they know about the shares? David's voice was tight with concern. More importantly, how do they have your number? In his penthouse, Elias sat surrounded by financial documents and legal papers, remembering late nights when Monroe would massage tension from his shoulders during big deals. Her fingers working magic that was part professional, part something neither would acknowledge. Those same hands had signed contracts, managed mergers, held his empire together while he played God on the 45th floor. Now she was the only thing standing between him and total destruction. His assistant called at 2:30 a.m. Sir, they're demanding your resignation. Effective immediately. Tell them to go to hell. Sir, they're not asking. The elevator in the Crowder building was climbing to the 45th floor, carrying the one person who could save everything, or destroy it with a single word. What would you do if someone who hurt you needed your help to save everything they built? Would you walk away, or would loyalty win? Tell me what choice you'd make. She walked into that boardroom like an angel of mercy or an angel of vengeance. Even she wasn't sure which. Monroe entered the boardroom in a crimson dress that commanded attention, her heels clicking against marble like a countdown. Every man in that room, worth billions combined, suddenly looked small compared to the woman they dismissed as just a secretary. The silence was deafening. Harrison Blackstone recovered first, his predatory smile faltering only slightly. "Ms. Baines, how unexpected. Is it?" Monroe's voice could have cut glass. "This is my company too, apparently." Oh. 12 faces turned toward the head of the table, where an empty chair had been waiting for Elias Crowder. Instead, Monroe walked past it and took the chair directly across from Blackstone, the position of power she should have occupied months ago. "Gentlemen, I believe you called this meeting to discuss my company's future, so let's discuss it." Peterson cleared his throat nervously. "Ms. Baines, this is highly irregular. You're not actually on the board." "No, but I own 42% of this company's voting shares, which make me the single largest individual shareholder in this room." Her smile was sharp enough to draw blood. "So, I suggest we proceed with proper respect for irregular circumstances." The boardroom windows framed Chicago's skyline like a painting of power and possibility. Monroe had looked out these windows 1,000 times while serving coffee and taking notes. Tonight, she was looking out as an owner. Blackstone leaned forward. "Your shares were transferred under questionable circumstances. We're prepared to challenge their validity. Go ahead." Every transfer was legal, documented, and approved by your own board, unless you're suggesting your previous votes were invalid. The trap was beautiful in its simplicity. To challenge Monroe's shares, they would have to invalidate the very board meetings that had approved them, meetings where they'd voted unanimously to trust Elias's judgment. "Where is Crowder?" demanded another board member. "This is his company." "Actually," Monroe said, pulling out her phone and scrolling through legal documents, "this is our company. It's 43%, my 42%, which means any decision affecting major operations requires both our signatures." The math was devastating. Combined, she and Elias controlled 85%. Separately, neither could be overthrown. Electric eye contact crossed the table as the boardroom door opened. Elias walked in looking like he'd been through hell. Suit wrinkled, hair disheveled, eyes wild with something between panic and desperate hope. He stopped dead when he saw Monroe. For 30 seconds, the most powerful people in Chicago watched a silent conversation happen between two people who'd been dancing around each other for 5 years. His obvious relief and admiration at her power play, the way he looked at her like she was salvation itself. Monroe, her name left his lips like a prayer. Elias. Her response was steady, professional, giving nothing away. But everyone in that room could feel the electricity between them, thick enough to choke on. Blackstone's voice cut through the tension. "This is touching, but we have business to conduct. The allegations against Mr. Crowder are serious. Stock manipulation, artificially inflating prices. With whose money?" Monroe's question was quiet, deadly. "Every share transfer, every price increase, every strategic decision for the past 18 months went through my desk first. If Elias is guilty of manipulation, then so am I. Are you prepared to charge the second largest shareholder in this company with conspiracy?" The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. "As majority shareholders," Monroe continued, "Elias and I call for a vote of no confidence in this hostile takeover attempt. All in favor of telling Blackstone Corporation to take their offer and shove it where the sun doesn't shine." 7 hands rose around the table. The coup was over before it began. As Monroe cast the deciding vote that saved his empire, Elias whispered 2 words across the table, "Thank you." But before she could respond, the conference room doors burst open. "Mr. Crowder, FBI, you're under arrest for securities fraud. Have you ever walked into a room and reclaimed power people try to take from you? How did it feel to prove them wrong? Drop a fire emoji if you've had that moment." They say when it rains, it pours, but nobody prepared Monroe for the hurricane that hit when Elias's past came knocking with handcuffs. Camera flashes exploded outside the Crowder building like lightning in a storm, reporters shoving microphones toward anyone who might have answers while Monroe pushed through the crowd, her focus laser-sharp on the man in handcuffs. "Mr. Crowder, did you steal from your investors? Is it true you've been running a pyramid scheme? What about your relationship with your secretary? Was she part of the fraud?" The questions flew like bullets, but Monroe didn't flinch. She'd walked through worse storms than this. Growing up on Chicago's South Side taught you how to move through chaos without losing your direction. Agent Rivera read Elias's rights in a voice that carried over the media circus. Securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud investors. You have the right to remain silent. But Elias wasn't looking at the FBI agent. Through the crowd, over the chaos, his eyes found Monroe's. The silent plea she saw there wasn't for her to save him. It was for her to run, to protect herself, to let him burn alone rather than get caught in his fire. Monroe stepped forward instead of back. "No comment," she told the first reporter who shoved a microphone in her face. No comment to the second. By the third, she'd reached the police car where they were putting Elias in the back seat. Brief moment when their eyes met through chaos. His desperate fear for her safety, her defiant loyalty blazing like a beacon. She pressed her palm against the window as the car pulled away, a gesture that would be on the front page of every newspaper in Chicago by morning. The FBI agents who stayed behind were thorough and merciless. They seized computers, files, financial records. 5 years of Monroe's careful organization scattered and bagged like evidence of crime she knew Elias hadn't committed. "Ms. Baines," Agent Rivera approached her as the media storm raged outside. "We'd like to ask you some questions." "About what?" "Your relationship with Mr. Crowder, the share transfers, what you knew and when you knew it." Monroe's laugh was bitter. "What I knew he was brilliant. I knew he worked 18-hour days to build something that mattered. What I didn't know was that he'd been making me a partner without telling me. Those share transfers could be seen as hush money, payment for silence about illegal activities. Or they could be seen as what they actually were, a man trying to show love the only way he knew how, and doing it badly." The agent's eyes sharpened. Love. Monroe realized her mistake too late. In trying to defend Elias, she'd revealed the one thing the media would latch onto like predators scenting blood. By 6 a.m., the headlines were brutal. Billionaire's secret affair with secretary. Love or conspiracy? The woman who owns half his empire, from desk to boardroom. The secretary who knew too much. Monroe's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Reporters, lawyers, business partners, concerned friends. Everyone wanted a piece of the story. Everyone wanted to know how a secretary from the South Side became the second most powerful person in corporate Chicago overnight. Her mother called at dawn, voice tight with worry. "Baby, what's all this mess on the news? Are you in trouble?" "No, Mama, I'm not in trouble. But someone I care about is. That white man who's all over the TV. Monroe, what have you gotten yourself into? How do you explain 5 years of unspoken feelings to someone who raised you to be practical above all else? How do you justify standing by a man when the whole world is calling him a criminal?" "I got myself into the truth, Mama." Finally, when someone you care about is in trouble, do you run toward them or away? What's the difference between loyalty and stupidity? Share your thoughts below. As they put Elias in the police car, he looked back at Monroe one last time. "The safe," he mouthed silently. "Combination is your birthday. Some secrets are buried so deep that uncovering them changes everything you thought you knew about the person you love." His private office felt like a mausoleum after the FBI raid, but the hidden safe behind his grandfather's portrait opened with a soft click that sounded like hope in the silence. Monroe's hands shook as she entered the numbers. Her birthday, month and day, wondering how long Elias had known the exact date when she'd never told him. The safe opened to reveal a treasure trove of documents that made her knees weak with relief and heartbreak combined. Financial records proving every transfer was legitimate. email chains showing his legal team's advice, bank statements demonstrating that every share given to her came from his personal holdings, not company funds, not theft, not fraud. Love, expressed in the language he knew best, power and ownership, and making sure she would never be powerless again. But it was the personal items that broke her heart. Photos of them together at company events, candid shots she didn't know he'd kept. Her in the background of his business dinner photos, competent and beautiful and essential. The way he'd looked at her in pictures she'd never seen, like she was the most important person in every room. A velvet box that made her breath catch. Inside, a ring that wasn't flashy or ostentatious. Simple, elegant, with a diamond that caught the morning light streaming through his office windows. The ring of a man who knew her taste better than she'd realized. Beneath it, a letter in his handwriting. Monroe, if you're reading this, something has gone very wrong. The shares were never about controlling you or manipulating you. They were about making sure that if anything happened to me, you would have the power to protect what we built together. I know I should have asked. I know I should have told you. But I was afraid that if you knew how much power you already had over me, you'd use it to leave. And I couldn't lose you. Not when losing you would mean losing the best part of myself. The ring was supposed to be a surprise. I was going to propose the night you found those documents. I was going to ask you to be my partner in everything, not just business. I was going to tell you that you were never my secretary. You were always my equal, my anchor, my heart. If you're reading this, I'm either dead or in prison. Either way, I need you to know you owe me nothing. The shares are yours with no strings attached. Build something beautiful with them. Build something worthy of the incredible woman you are. I love you. I've loved you since the day you organized my chaos into something meaningful. I should have said it every day for 5 years. All my love, Elias. Monroe sank into his desk chair, surrounded by evidence of a love so deep and patient and quietly devoted that it took her breath away. The man the FBI had arrested wasn't a criminal. He was someone who'd been planning to give her the world and had been too afraid to ask if she wanted it. Her phone buzzed. Text from the county jail. Monroe, if you're reading this message, you found the safe. I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry I loved you badly. You deserve better than a man who hides his feelings behind stock transfers and legal documents. Walk away. Save yourself. E. She typed back immediately. Too late for that. We're in this together now. And Elias? Next time you want to tell me you love me, just say the words. M. His response came 5 minutes later. You magnificent woman. When I get out of here, we're going to have a very long conversation. And Monroe, thank you for seeing the man I never let anyone else see. Touching documents he'd marked with her initials, finding photos of them together at company events he'd kept, discovering he'd been planning to propose before everything went wrong. Monroe felt something shift in her chest. Not just forgiveness, but understanding. Love wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, patient, building foundations while you weren't looking. Sometimes it was someone making sure you had power, even when they forgot to tell you about it. Has someone ever protected you in ways you didn't know about until later? How did it feel to discover hidden depths in someone you thought you knew? Tell me about that revelation. The final document in the safe made her hands tremble. A business plan for a foundation focused on supporting women of color in corporate America. Every detail mapped out, funding secured, her name listed as director. At the bottom, a handwritten note. For Monroe, because you showed me what real strength looks like, and the world needs more leaders like you. He hadn't just been planning to make her his wife. He'd been planning to help her change the world. They underestimated the quiet woman who ran things from behind the scenes. And now she was about to show Chicago why that was their biggest mistake. Monroe stood at the bathroom mirror at 5 a.m., applying lipstick with the precision of a surgeon. Red, blood red, not because she felt like a victim, but because she was about to go to war. The press conference podium felt like a battlefield, cameras aimed like weapons while Monroe stood in white. Not surrendering, but declaring war on everyone who'd underestimated the woman behind the man. She adjusted the microphone and looked directly into the lens of Channel 7's camera. My name is Monroe Baines. For 5 years, I was called Elias Crowder's secretary. Today, I'm here as his business partner and the woman who's going to expose the real criminals in this story. Reporters erupted with questions, but Monroe raised her hand for silence. The room obeyed instantly. 3 days ago, the FBI arrested an innocent man based on falsified documents. The real conspiracy involves Blackstone Corporation, Mitchell and Associates, and a coordinated effort to destroy Crowder Industries through character assassination. She pulled out a stack of papers that made the reporters lean forward like hungry wolves. I have phone recordings, email exchanges, financial records showing payments made to fabricate evidence. And most importantly, I have the truth about who really embezzled those funds. Camera flashes exploded as she held up a photograph. James Mitchell, senior partner at Mitchell and Associates, authorized the transfer of $2.3 million to his personal account in the Cayman Islands. The same James Mitchell who provided the evidence against Elias Crowder to federal investigators. The room went dead silent. You want to know why they targeted Elias? Because he refused to sell Crowder Industries to Blackstone. Because he wouldn't fire half his workforce to increase profit margins. Because he chose integrity over easy money. Monroe's voice rose with controlled fury. But here's what they didn't count on. I know every contract, every deal, every financial decision made in the past 5 years. I was there for all of it. And I prepare to testify under oath that Elias Crowder is the most honest businessman in Chicago. A reporter from the Tribune shouted, "Ms. Baines, what's your relationship with Mr. Crowder?" Monroe smiled for the first time since taking the podium. "I'm the woman who's in love with him. I'm also the woman who owns 37% of his company. And I'm the woman who's going to make sure justice is served." The room exploded with noise, but Monroe was already walking away, her white heels clicking against marble like a countdown to war. Back in her car, she pulled out her phone and typed, "Your move, Mitchell." The response came within minutes. "You have no idea what you've started." Monroe laughed out loud as she typed back, "Honey, I'm just getting started. Would you fight for someone's reputation, even if it meant putting your own on the line? What would make you go to war for another person? Share what's worth fighting for." As Monroe's press conference ended, her phone buzzed with a text from the county jail. "You magnificent woman. When I get out of here, we're going to have a very long conversation. And Monroe, thank you for seeing the man I never let anyone else see." She pressed the phone to her chest and whispered, "Hold on, baby. I'm coming for you." Freedom tastes different when someone fights for it on your behalf. Sweeter, more precious, and infinitely more humbling. The charges were dropped at 3:17 p.m. on a Tuesday. Monroe knew because she'd been counting every minute since her press conference 3 days earlier. She waited in the parking lot of Cook County Jail, leaning against her car in jeans and a Northwestern University sweatshirt. His sweatshirt that she'd stolen from his office years ago and never returned. When Elias walked through those doors, he looked older, tired. But when he saw her, something lit up in his eyes that made her forget how to breathe. The empty 45th floor stretched between them like 5 years of unspoken words. But when he stepped from the elevator and saw her silhouetted against the Chicago skyline, the distance collapsed into nothing. "You came," he said, his voice rough from 3 days of hell. "Did you think I wouldn't?" He crossed the office slowly, like he was afraid she might disappear. "Monroe, what you did at that press conference." She pressed her finger to his lips. "We can talk later. Right now, I just need to hold you." When he kissed her, it tasted like relief and gratitude and something deeper that neither of them had ever named out loud. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered against her mouth. "You can't lose something you never really had." "What does that mean?" Monroe pulled back to look at him, her hands framing his face. "It means you spent 5 years trying to protect me, provide for me, take care of me. But you never asked me what I wanted." His shoulders sagged. "Monroe, I wanted you to see me. Not as your assistant, not as someone who needed saving, but as your equal. As someone capable of fighting beside you instead of behind you. I see you now. Do you? Because 3 days ago, you told me to walk away and save myself. You still don't understand that saving you is saving myself." He stared at her for a long moment, and she watched something shift in his expression. "You're not leaving," he said. "I'm not leaving. Even though this is going to get messy, before it gets better. Especially because of that." He kissed her again, and this time it was different. Desperate. Hungry. 5 years of want concentrated into a single moment. They made love right there on the leather couch where she'd spent countless late nights. But this time she wasn't serving him. She was claiming him, and he was letting her. Afterward, as they lay tangled together, Elias traced patterns on her bare shoulder. "Monroe," he whispered, "there's one more thing I need to tell you about those shares." Her blood went cold. After everything they'd been through, there were still secrets? What now, Elias? "The shares weren't just about making you my business partner." She sat up, pulling the throw blanket around herself. "Then what were they about?" He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Have you ever had to nearly lose someone to realize how much they meant? What would you say if you got a second chance? Tell me about your what-if moment." Monroe's heart stopped as he opened the box, revealing a diamond that caught the city lights like captured stars. They were about making you my wife. The shares were just the beginning. What he'd really been planning was a future she'd never dared to imagine. Monroe stared at the ring like it might bite her. "How long? How long what? How long have you been planning this?" Elias sat up, suddenly vulnerable in a way that made her chest ache. 2 years, maybe longer. I kept telling myself it was just business, that making you a partner was just smart strategy. But the truth is, I couldn't imagine running this company without you. I couldn't imagine my life without you. So, why didn't you just tell me? Because I'm an idiot. Monroe laughed despite herself. That's not an answer. Because I was terrified you'd say no. Because I knew I didn't deserve you. Because I'd spent so long being the boss that I forgot how to be the man. He took the ring from the box, but didn't reach for her hand. "The night you resigned, I was going to ask you. I had dinner planned, flowers, the whole thing. And then you walked in with that letter, and I realized I'd waited too long. You could have stopped me." "How?" "By telling you I'd been making major financial decisions about your life without asking. By admitting I'd been in love with my employee for years. By proving that every professional boundary we'd maintained was a lie." Monroe was quiet for a long moment. "Ask me now." "What?" "Ask me now. The right way." The engagement ring caught Chicago's city lights like captured stars, but Monroe barely glanced at the diamond. She couldn't look away from the man offering her not just jewelry, but his entire world. Elias slid off the couch and got down on one knee, completely naked, holding a 3-carat diamond in a law office at midnight. It was the most ridiculous and perfect moment of Monroe's life. "Monroe Baines, will you marry me? Not as my employee, not as my business partner, but as my equal? Will you build an empire with me instead of just working for one?" She pretended to think about it. "What kind of benefits package are we talking about?" He grinned. "Full medical, dental, vision, unlimited vacation time, executive parking space, and you get to boss around the CEO whenever you want. Whenever I want. Whenever you want. Deal." She held out her left hand, and when he slipped the ring onto her finger, it fit perfectly. "How did you know my ring size?" "I've been watching you for 5 years, Monroe. I know everything about you." "Not everything." Something in her tone made him look up sharply. "What do you mean?" Monroe smiled, the kind of smile that held secrets. "I mean, there's something I need to tell you too." "What?" "I've been in love with you since my second week on the job." "Your second week? What happened your first week?" "First week I thought you were an arrogant jerk. Second week I realized you stayed until midnight because you cared about every single employee in this building. That's when I knew I was in trouble." They made love again, slower this time, like they had all the time in the world. Because finally they did. When someone offers you their whole world, do you take it or do you build something new together? What's the difference between joining someone's life and creating a life together? Share your thoughts. As dawn broke over Chicago, painting the skyline gold, Monroe looked at the ring on her finger and smiled. "So," she said, "what exactly does a Cosio do around here?" His answer would determine not just their future, but the future of everyone who'd ever underestimated the power of recognition. "Whatever she wants," he said. "This is your company too now." "Good, because I have some ideas about changes we need to make." "Such as?" such as making sure no other woman has to choose between being seen and being safe, such as making sure every employee in this building knows their worth, such as showing Chicago what happens when you stop treating people like they're replaceable. Elias kissed her forehead. I love your brain almost as much as I love the rest of you. Almost. Okay, just as much. Better. They say behind every great man is a great woman. But what happens when she stepped beside him instead? 6 months later, the boardroom that once felt like a battleground now hummed with collaborative energy, 2 chairs at the head of the table where there used to be one. Symbols of power shared rather than hoarded. The diversity initiative is showing incredible results, Monroe announced to the board. Employee satisfaction is up 37%. Productivity has increased by 22%, and we've retained 94% of our staff. Board member Harrison Wolf leaned back in his chair. And how exactly do these numbers translate to profit? Monroe smiled the same smile she'd perfected during her press conference. Happy employees work harder, Mr. Wolf. Valued employees stay longer. Respected employees become brand ambassadors. In the past 6 months, we've had 0 turnover in senior positions and a waiting list of qualified candidates who want to work here. What Ms. Baines is saying, Elias added, is that treating people like human beings is actually good business. Wolf looked skeptical, and the wedding planning isn't a distraction. Monroe and Elias exchanged a look that made the temperature in the room rise by 10 degrees. On the contrary, Monroe said, planning our future has made us both more invested in the success of this company. After the meeting, they walked back to their shared office. A space redesigned with 2 desks, 2 chairs, and a couch where they held informal meetings that somehow resulted in better decisions than the boardroom ever had. Did you see Wolf's face when you mentioned the diversity numbers? Elias asked, loosening his tie. Did you see his face when you backed me up? Monroe countered, kicking off her heels. I'll always back you up, even when I'm wrong, especially when you're wrong. That's when you need it most. She threw a pin at him, but he caught it and pulled her into his arms. 3 weeks, he murmured against her neck. 3 weeks until what? Until you're legally stuck with me. I'm already legally stuck with you. We're business partners. This is different. Ow! Because in 3 weeks, I get to introduce you as my wife instead of my co-CEO. Why can't I be both? You can be both. You can be anything you want. Monroe pulled back to look at him, her engagement ring catching the afternoon light streaming through their office windows. I want to be the woman who changes how business is done in this city. I want to be the wife who makes you better instead of smaller. I want to be the CEO who remembers what it feels like to need a job. And I want to be the husband who deserves all of that. They were interrupted by Monroe's assistant. Yes, she had her own assistant now, knocking on the door. Ms. Baines? The photographer is here for the Chicago Business Journal feature. Monroe looked at Elias, who nodded. Send them in, Jessica. The photographer spent 20 minutes capturing them in their element, reviewing contracts, discussing strategy, laughing at inside jokes that nobody else understood. One more shot, the photographer said. Can you look at each other like you're in love? Monroe and Elias burst out laughing. We are in love, Monroe said. I know, but can you look more in love? More in love, Elias repeated. Lady, I've been crazy about this woman for 5 years. This is as in love as it gets. The photographer snapped the picture just as Monroe reached up to straighten his collar, both of them laughing, both of them completely unself-conscious. 3 weeks later, that photo would run on the cover of Chicago Business Journal with the headline, Power Couple Redefines Corporate Leadership. But that afternoon, as the photographer packed up and left, Monroe felt something shift inside her chest. Not anxiety or fear, but recognition. This was what happiness felt like. What would change in your workplace if partnership replaced hierarchy? How different would your relationships be if power was shared instead of controlled? Dream big in the comments. The morning of their wedding, Monroe stood in her dress looking out at Lake Michigan when her phone buzzed. The text made her smile. Ready to conquer the world together, Mrs. Crowder? She typed back. Ready to conquer the world together, Mr. Baines Crowder. Hyphenated names now. Hyphenated everything now. We're partners, remember? I remember. See you at the altar, partner. But Monroe had news that would make their conquest even sweeter. The queen of the 45th floor was no longer behind the throne. She was building a kingdom where everyone could wear crowns. The Chicago Cultural Center sparkled with their wedding reception, but the real celebration was in Monroe's eyes, no longer hiding her light, but illuminating everyone around her with the confidence that comes from being truly seen. 300 guests filled the Renaissance ballroom, but Monroe only had eyes for one person. Elias looked devastating in his tuxedo, but what took her breath away was the expression on his face as she walked down the aisle. Wonder, gratitude, love so pure it made her forget every moment of doubt she'd ever had. "Dearly beloved," the officiant began, but Monroe barely heard the words. She was too busy memorizing the moment. The way the late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, the sound of her cousin David wiping away tears in the front row, the feeling of finally being exactly where she belonged. "The bride and groom have written their own vows," the officiant announced. Elias went first, his voice steady, but his hands shaking slightly as he unfolded a piece of paper. "Monroe, for 5 years I thought I was the king of my own castle. I thought power meant control, success meant isolation, and love was a luxury I couldn't afford. You taught me that real power comes from partnership. Real success comes from lifting others up. And love isn't a luxury. It's the foundation that makes everything else possible." He folded the paper and looked directly into her eyes. "You were never my secretary. You were always my heart. Today, I'm asking you to be my partner in every sense of the word. To build something bigger than either of us could create alone. To love me even when I'm being an idiot, which, let's face it, will happen regularly." The guests laughed, but Monroe was crying too hard to join in. "Monroe," the officiant prompted gently. She cleared her throat and pulled out her own folded paper, then immediately put it away. "I had a speech planned," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the ballroom. "Something about how marriage is a business merger of hearts, how love is the best investment strategy, all kinds of corporate metaphors that would have made sense." She reached for Elias's hands. "But standing here now, all I can think about is a scared girl from the South Side who walked into the 45th floor 5 years ago and convinced herself she was invisible. You saw me, Elias. Not just my work, not just my potential, but me. The woman who eats pizza for breakfast, who cries at commercials, who spent her whole life thinking she wasn't worth fighting for." Her voice grew stronger. "You fought for me before I even knew we were at war. You loved me before I learned how to love myself. And now I get to spend the rest of my life showing you that the best partnerships aren't about one person rescuing another. They're about two people choosing to build something beautiful together." She squeezed his hands. "So yes, I'll be your wife. I'll be your business partner. I'll be your best friend and your biggest supporter, and occasionally your worst nightmare when you try to make decisions without consulting me." The crowd erupted in laughter and applause. "But mostly, I'll be the woman who loves you exactly as you are while believing completely in who you're becoming." By the time they exchanged rings, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. "You may kiss the bride," the officiant announced. But before Elias could move, Monroe grabbed his face and kissed him first to thunderous applause and cheers. During dinner, Monroe clinked her champagne glass to get everyone's attention. "I have an announcement," she said, her voice carrying across the ballroom. Elias looked at her curiously. This wasn't part of the program. 2 weeks ago, Elias and I established the Baines Crowder Foundation for Professional Women of Color. Our mission is to ensure that no woman has to choose between being seen and being safe, between professional advancement and personal dignity. The room erupted in applause, but Monroe wasn't finished. The foundation will provide mentorship, financial support, and most importantly, networks of power for women who've been excluded from boardrooms and corner offices for too long. More applause, but Monroe held up her hand. "But tonight, I have an even bigger announcement." She looked at Elias, who was starting to suspect where this was going. "In 7 months, we're going to need to hire a babysitter." The ballroom went completely silent for 3 seconds and then erupted in chaos. Elias stared at her, his mouth open. "You're pregnant?" "We're pregnant." He picked her up and spun her around right there on the dance floor, her white dress spinning out like a cloud. "When did you find out?" "This morning. I wanted to tell you before the ceremony, but I also wanted to surprise you in front of everyone who supported us." "A baby," he said, like he was testing out the words. "A baby who's going to grow up in a world where partnerships matter more than power, where love is stronger than fear, and where everyone gets to wear a crown." They danced until midnight, surrounded by friends and family and colleagues who'd watched them transform from boss and employee to husband and wife to partners in every sense of the word. Later, in the bridal suite at the Palmer house, Monroe stood at the window in her negligee, looking out at the city that had witnessed their entire love story. "What are you thinking about?" Elias asked, coming up behind her to wrap his arms around her waist. "I'm thinking about that scared girl who walked into your office 5 years ago. If someone had told her she'd end up here, married to you, running a company, starting a foundation, carrying your baby, she would have laughed. What would you tell her now?" Monroe leaned back against his chest, her hand moving instinctively to her still flat stomach. "I tell her that sometimes the best things come from the worst moments. That sometimes you have to quit to find out what you're really worth. That sometimes the person who seems impossible to reach is just waiting for someone brave enough to extend their hand." Elias turned her around to face him. "And what would you tell me? The arrogant CEO who thought he could control everything. I tell you that love isn't about control. It's about choice. Every single day, we choose each other. Every single day, we choose to build something together instead of apart." They made love as husband and wife for the first time, but it felt like a continuation of everything they'd already built together. Passion and tenderness, strength and vulnerability. Two people who'd finally learned that the best victories are the ones you share. So what would you do if someone saw your potential before you believed in it yourself? Would you hide behind old patterns or step into your power? Tell me in the comments what crown you're ready to claim. If this story of recognition, respect, and real partnership touched your heart, smash that like button. Subscribe for more stories that celebrate the power of seeing and being seen. Comment below with what moment in Monroe and Elias's journey resonated most with you. And remember, you were never meant to be invisible. Your time to shine is now.